Hello and welcome to Navigating Conversations After Suicide Loss, the interview series on how to break the silence and shatter the stigma so you can keep your loved one's memory alive. I created the series to give you all a go-to place with plenty of helpful resources, advice, and encouragement from those who are experts in their field, so you can talk about your suicide loss journey with confidence. Let's make a deal. Commit to taking one action after you watch this interview, because time alone doesn't heal our wounds. It's so important what you do with your time. I'm your host, Caro Brookings, and with me today is Marianne Gouveia. Marianne left corporate America to pursue a business coaching certification through the Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching. After the loss of her youngest son, she chose to turn her tragedy into good for others. She founded Eric's House in 2017 to help those left behind sort through these devastating losses in order to integrate their grief so they may find joy and happiness again. Eric's House helps people rise, survive, and thrive even in the face of devastation. Marianne is a professional certified coach with the International Coaching Federation, a certified grief recovery specialist, and a certified grief companion with the Dr. Wolfert method. Welcome, Marianne. It's so good to have you back with us today. Tell us a bit more about your story and how you got here.
Well, first of all, thank you, Caro. It's good to see you as always. As you said, I spent 35 years in the aerospace world. And I decided to leave because I wanted to get a coaching degree to help other women in that kind of competitive corporate environment. And during that process, my youngest son, Eric, died. And that was almost 8 years ago. And so for me, there really was no help available. I looked for counselors. I went to bunches of support groups. I started learning everything I could learn about suicide, but there was really no support for me as a mom. And so that's why we founded Eric's House. I looked at my husband one day and I said, we have to do something to make resources available to people who really need it. I know in my case, I felt very alone, very isolated. And I felt really stigmatized, as you know, because my son died by suicide. And so there was, for everyone, I think it's a really complex, overwhelming experience. And I like to talk about the word integration because we eventually learn to integrate our grief in a healthy and positive way. And that includes overcoming some of the stigma around suicide.
Yeah, I can really relate to what you said in terms of, there not being enough support out there. When my mom took her life nearly 10 years ago now, I felt exactly the same. There was nothing out there. You try different things, but no one's really equipped to help you deal with that kind of loss. So as you know, I love Eric's House and what you put out there. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Yeah. And let's talk to our viewers now who, want to be confident in social settings and, not dread those questions. And talking about those questions, how can our viewers answer those tricky questions?
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit in general and then talk about my own experiences. So when we go into social circumstances, we're already overwhelmed with what's going to happen, who's going to talk to me, who's not going to talk to me. We always have triggers. And so we go into social settings already vulnerable. And so the best thing to do is identify in your own mind sort of a plan, a what if plan. What if somebody asked me about how, or had some fascination about what happened? When people ask you, do you feel guilty? Do you feel like you're to blame? What would you have done differently? I think we just have to establish within ourselves what we're comfortable talking about. So I know for me, I avoided social situations until I was ready.
Mhm.
I also decided, well, I have to return to living, because we all do. We all have to return to living our lives. And I just decided that I had some canned answers. So when somebody said, you know, I'm really sorry for your loss. Can you tell me what happened? I just simply say, I'm not ready to talk about it, but thank you for asking.
Mhm.
Or if somebody says, do you feel guilty about what happened? And I've been asked that question before. I always say, well, not really, because I know I loved my son and he loved me. And, we worked together from the day he was born to the day he died. So I have canned answers which politely give the other person an opportunity to stop talking. So,
Yeah. I think that's really important, because what I find is that, and not even with suicide loss, but in general, I find we kind of feel obliged to answer people's questions, so it can get a bit awkward, and we might end up down a path that we didn't want to go down. So this is a reminder for our viewers to say, okay, I'm not comfortable talking about this, or whichever way they want to put it.
Yeah. And I also mentioned earlier, Caro, that we should have a plan, because when we go into social settings, we don't know what's going to trigger us. We know there's a possibility that we're going to be triggered by something. I know for me, anytime I saw a young man with a certain ball cap on, it would trigger me. But in working with our clients, what we've learned is that going into social settings where other people are talking about their children, or let's take, in the case of perhaps a high school graduation, going to a graduation party where your child would have been graduating. Those kinds of circumstances can be very, very triggering. And so I always suggest that people have an out. Right? They give themselves permission to just leave, remove themselves from the setting, and just kind of regroup, because we're not going to be perfect in every setting. We have to give ourselves permission to acknowledge how we're feeling, honor and respect how we're feeling, and then take care of ourselves in that moment.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm curious, what I find is the most tricky question for those parents who lost a child to suicide is, how many children do you have? So I'm going to ask everyone who's lost their child, so people can get an idea. So how do you answer that question?
Okay, so I think it's a learned response. I think as time goes on, you kind of want people to acknowledge your pain. And so sometimes we find that in the beginning we say, well, I have 3, but one's in heaven. But then that just begs the question, oh, really, what happened? How did your child die? So I learned over time, if I feel like having a conversation with that particular person, I'll say what I'm comfortable saying. If it's a social situation where I really don't know people, I just answer it by saying, I have 3. I have 3 children. Just because our child has left us too soon, or our mom or our dad or our spouse, doesn't mean they didn't exist. They exist. They exist in life and they exist in death. But the trick is to feel comfortable with the person you're talking to. And over time, you learn it's really not important to tell people about your experience with the loss of a loved one.
Yeah, no, that's a great response. Thank you so much. And can you talk a bit more about how our viewers can honor their loved ones and tell their story in social settings?
So we can talk about our children any way we choose to, any way we're comfortable talking about them. And just because they died doesn't mean we can't talk about their lives. And so I might just tell a story about Eric. And people don't have to know whether he's here or not, especially with people that don't know. In a situation where I have family around or close friends around, we just talk about it, and they don't necessarily want to talk about it. But I might say, hey, I've got a story about Eric I want to tell you all. And then they just all stop and they listen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, sometimes I ask people to tell a little story about Eric, and sometimes that's not always very comfortable. People are not comfortable talking about it. But when you speak about it, it gives them permission to talk about it, and it removes the fear of them perhaps hurting you or triggering you.
Yeah. So do you find that even just asking the question sort of gives them the permission just to say, oh, could you share something about Eric? And they're like, oh, okay, it's okay to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. It takes away their fear of hurting you by bringing it up.
Yeah, I agree. And that what you mentioned about talking about Eric, if people don't know you and you just tell a story about him, you're right that they don't need to know that he's passed away. So I think that's a genius idea. Never thought about that. So thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
And one thing that you always say is that secrecy breeds shame, and stigma and all of these things are often attached to our loss. So how can talking about the suicide loss and our grief help combat the stigma?
Well, people are afraid of the S word. And there's many reasons for that. Sometimes it's a little too close to home, and maybe they've experienced suicidal thoughts of their own, or suicidal thoughts of someone they love, or maybe someone in their past has died by suicide. And culturally, especially in the West, we're grief avoidant. So suicide grief that comes with a lot of stigma is just completely taboo. When you're able to say the word, when you're able to acknowledge the truth is that in the United States, I don't know about Canada, every 11 minutes now there's a suicide. So it's highly unlikely that you haven't experienced it in your life. So by talking about it, takes the fear away. It gives permission to people who might be struggling to talk about it with somebody so that they can figure out how to live a healthy life. And I feel I read a study, Caro, I think it was in a National Institute of Health, where they interviewed 27 participants, and they compared suicide bereavement to bereavement by sudden loss and bereavement by natural death. And the three things that really differentiated suicide is the fact that people avoided the word.
Okay. Yeah.
Like I said, it's kind of a scary word. People are afraid to say, my son died by suicide, my mom died by suicide. And they're also afraid that they don't get the support they need, even from clinical communities. So take the power and fear out of the word, gives other people the opportunity to talk about it openly and honestly, without shame and without judgment.
Yeah, I agree. So important. When you were saying that, I thought, people aren't scared to say, oh, my loved one died of cancer, or they had a heart attack, right? But as soon as it's suicide, someone said to me not long ago, talking about suicide is a great way to clear the room, because people, they're uncomfortable and they just all leave. And we smile about it now, but it's a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of professionals just are beginning to say they died of depression or they died from a mental health issue, so that the word is not necessarily used. But I just think that the more you talk about it, the more it goes into the mainstream, the more it gives other people the opportunity to talk about what they need to say about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I also think, Caro, that um, when uh, when you have somebody close to you who dies by suicide, there's I mentioned isolation. There's quite a bit of isolation that goes with that. And there's judgment. And so judgment is something must be wrong with that family because somebody died by suicide. I had a client tell me one time that she felt people would drive by her home and point at that house saying somebody died by suicide in that house. So there's just there's a lot of judgment around it, and we need to encourage people to release themselves of any judgment as it relates to a death by suicide.
Yeah, I agree. And I love what you mentioned as well around opening up so others can open up. So for me, at the beginning, for sure, I didn't talk about anyone about with regards to my mom's suicide apart from close friends and family. And then as I started to open up, because I rewired my brain around all of this, I found out that my hairdresser, whom I had gone to for years, and one of my former bosses, they both lost someone by suicide, and I never knew, and they never shared until I shared.
Yeah, yeah. Gives people permission to talk about that which is unthinkable.
Yeah, and they know there's someone who gets it, who's not gonna judge them, who's not, it's just someone who understands how they're feeling.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So wrapping up then, Marianne, if you were gonna leave our viewers with one single action today, what would it be?
I would, because of our topic today, I would encourage people just to think about how they want to talk about it. Give themselves permission to release fear and judgment for themselves so that when they speak about it, they feel confident and confident and even relieved that they don't have to carry that burden of stigma with them. So just have a plan. Think about how you want to communicate around the loss.
Yeah, amazing. And I know you've got a free gift to give away as well. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it's an ebook. It's called A Grief Perspective, and it really is an opening and a sharing of my feelings in the early part of my journey. And of course, Dr. Wolfelt is my mentor, and so I have some golden nuggets in there from Dr. Wolfelt that I think really resonate with people who are struggling with a loss.
Yeah, amazing. And again, you sharing your journey from the early days again gives people the knowledge, okay, I'm not alone, other people feel like this, and that might help break the isolation as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you so much for speaking with us today. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you, Caro, for doing the work that you're doing. I know you're reaching a lot of people. And I love all of your rewiring your brain. I think that's a really important conversation in this loss experience. So thank you for all the work that you do. And of course, I encourage your viewers to keep going with you because I know that you're really healing people.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So to our viewers then, be sure to tune into our next interviews for more valuable advice and encouragement on your suicide bereavement journey. Until then, take care and see you in the next interview. Bye-bye.